My name is Maren Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and 3 weeks after we buried my grandmother, my brother stood in her kitchen and toasted his own family with a glass of her good sherry, celebrating the sale of her house before the flowers I'd arranged for her funeral had even finished wilting on her grave. Picture it. 6 people crowded into that narrow farmhouse kitchen on Larkspur Lane, the one with the crooked cabinet door Grandma Nell never let anyone fix, because she said a house should show its age like a face shows its life. My brother Derek in a blazer he definitely couldn't afford. His fiancée Alyssa glowing beside him, her parents nodding along like they were watching a young man come into his inheritance the honest way. Derek raised his glass toward the window, toward the garden Grandma had built with her own 2 hands over 60 years, and said, "She would have wanted me to have it. She always said this place needed someone who could actually take care of it." I was standing in the doorway holding a manila envelope I'd driven 40 minutes to deliver in person, and when I finally spoke, my brother's face did something I will remember until the day I die. It went from confusion to disbelief to a kind of gray, sinking understanding, all in about 4 seconds. Alyssa's mother set down her glass very quietly. Alyssa herself didn't say a word for the rest of the night. But that moment only makes sense if I take you back 6 weeks. To the night my grandmother died with her hand in mine, and to a business card I found in her nightstand 3 days later that I was never supposed to see. Welcome back to her quiet reckoning, where the loudest people in the family are never the ones who actually hold the power. If you've ever been the one who showed up while someone else made plans, this story is for you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this is your first time here, subscribe, because I promise you, the ending of this one is worth the wait. I own a small flower shop in Millbrook Falls called Bennett & Bloom. I started it 8 years ago in a space that used to be a shoe repair store, with a cooler I bought used from a grocery store going out of business, and a delivery van with a check engine light that never turns off. It's not a big operation. It's mine, and the arrangements I do for funerals in this town, I do slower and more carefully than any other order I take, because flowers for the dead are the last thing you ever get to say to them. My grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, everyone called her Grandma Nell, was 89 years old when she died in April. She lived alone on Larkspur Lane in the farmhouse my great-grandfather built, with a garden that took up nearly the whole back acre, tomatoes and dahlias and a row of peonies. She'd started from cuttings off her own mother's plants 40 years earlier. She taught me to garden the way some grandmothers teach their granddaughters to bake. I was out there with her every Sunday of my childhood, small enough that she had to lift me over the fence rail, and every Sunday for the last 4 years of her life, now that I was old enough to be the one doing the lifting, the one driving over with groceries, the one who sat with her through 2 hospitalizations, and 1 very long winter, when her hip made stairs impossible and I moved a bed into her front parlor so she wouldn't have to leave the house she loved. My brother Derek is 5 years older than me. He moved 2 states away after college and built a life that looked, from a distance, like the kind of life our family was supposed to be proud of. A sales job with a fancy title, a leased car he changed every 2 years, a fiancée named Alyssa, whose family owned 3 car dealerships and a house on a lake that wasn't the lake our family actually came from. Derek called Grandma Nell on her birthday. He came for Christmas, maybe every other year. For most of the last decade, if you'd asked either of us how close we were to our grandmother, I think we both would have told you the truth. And the truth would not have been flattering to him. That changed the winter Grandma Nell was diagnosed with vascular dementia. It started small. She'd repeat a question she'd asked 20 minutes earlier. She'd call me by my mother's name once or twice and then catch herself, embarrassed, waving it off like swatting a fly. Her doctor told us this was a slow decline, not a cliff. Good days and bad days for years, possibly, before anything drastic. I adjusted. I started coming twice a week instead of once. I set up pill organizers with the days printed in letters big enough for her to read without her glasses. I taped a laminated calendar to her refrigerator with everyone's names and phone numbers on it, because she liked having something solid to look at when her memory felt like water. And that was the winter Derek started calling more. I want to be fair to him here, because for about 2 months I actually believed it was guilt turning into love, the kind of wake-up call that happens to people when they realize a parent or grandparent won't be around forever. He drove up on a Saturday in January, unannounced, with a bag of her favorite peppermint candies and a portable heater for her bedroom. He sat with her for 3 hours. He posted a photo of the two of them on the porch with a caption about how much she meant to him. My mother, Diane, cried actual tears of joy over that photo at Sunday dinner. I remember feeling something twist in my stomach that I couldn't name yet, something between relief and suspicion. And I told myself I was being small for even noticing it. 3 weeks before Grandma Nell died, I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon to bring her groceries and found Derek's car already in the driveway. This wasn't unusual by then. He'd been coming up almost weekly. What was unusual was the man getting out of a second car parked behind his, a man in a gray suit carrying a leather folder, the kind of folder that belongs to lawyers and loan officers and nobody else. I asked Derek who he was. Derek smiled the easy, practiced smile he's had since we were kids, the one that used to get him out of trouble with our parents while I stood next to him getting blamed for things I hadn't done, and said, "Oh, that's just Grandma's financial guy, helping her simplify some paperwork. Boring stuff. You don't need to worry about it." I should have asked more questions that day. I didn't, because Grandma Nell was having a good day, sharp and funny, and asking about my shop, and I let myself be distracted by the good day instead of the man with the folder. That's a decision I've turned over more times than I can count since. Grandma Nell died on a Thursday night in April, peacefully, in her own bed, with me holding her hand and a home hospice nurse checking her pulse every 20 minutes until there wasn't one to check anymore. My mother arrived an hour after it happened. Derek arrived the next morning from 2 states away, and to his credit, he cried real tears at her bedside. And for one day, I let myself believe that whatever complicated thing had been happening with him and Grandma Nell that winter, at the bottom of it, there had been real love. I did the flowers for her funeral myself, white peonies because she'd grown them her whole life, and a few stems of the dahlias she'd been so proud of, cut from her own garden 3 days before she died and kept alive in my shop's cooler for exactly this purpose. I arranged them at 4 a.m, alone, crying into a cooler full of the flowers my grandmother taught me to love. I want you to remember that detail because it matters later. Those flowers hadn't even finished wilting on her grave when the next part of this story started. 3 days after the funeral, I went back to the farmhouse to start the slow, awful task of sorting through her things. The job that always falls to whoever loved someone enough to be the one who does it. I was looking through her nightstand for her reading glasses, which my mother wanted to keep, when I found a business card tucked into the back pocket of an old address book. Whitcomb and Lowe, attorneys at law. Daniel Whitcomb, estate planning. I didn't recognize the name. Grandma Nell's longtime lawyer, the one who'd handled Grandpa's estate decades earlier and updated her will after that, was a man named Roland Fitch, semi-retired, someone our whole family had known for 30 years. I'd never heard her mention a Whitcomb. I set the card aside and kept looking for the glasses, and found something else instead, a small brass key, taped to the underside of the nightstand's bottom drawer, the kind of hiding spot that only makes sense if you're trying to keep something from someone specific, not from everyone. If you've ever found something in a loved one's belongings that made your stomach drop before you even understood why, tell me in the comments, because that key sat in my palm for a long time before I understood what it meant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened in the 2 weeks after that, because it explains everything that key eventually opened. The Monday after the funeral, my mother called me in tears, though not the kind of tears I expected. "Derek wants to talk to us about the house," she said. "He thinks it's best if we sell quickly, before it needs more upkeep than any of us can manage. He's already found a realtor. Already, 4 days after we buried her." I drove to my mother's house that evening, and Derek was there with a folder of his own, considerably thicker than the one the man in the gray suit had carried into Grandma's driveway weeks earlier. He'd printed comparable home sales from the county records office. He'd gotten a verbal estimate from a realtor named Craig Doyle, a man Derek had apparently known since high school. He talked about market conditions and closing costs and capital gains with the fluency of someone who had clearly done this kind of homework before, and I remember thinking, distantly, that Derek had never once in his adult life shown this kind of diligence about anything that wasn't for his own direct benefit. "We all inherit equally," Derek said, not quite meeting my eyes. "That's what the old will says. Equal split. 3 ways. You, me, and Mom gets the household items. So we sell, we split the proceeds, everybody's taken care of. I asked when he'd last actually seen the will. "Fitch has a copy," he said. "It's not complicated. Mom's seen it too." My mother nodded along, the way she has nodded along with Derek her entire life, ever since he was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was the quiet one who was simply expected to manage. I didn't push back that night. I told them I needed time. Derek's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the look he gets when something isn't moving as fast as he wants it to. I called Roland Fitch's office the next morning, and his assistant told me something that stopped me cold. Mr. Fitch had retired from active estate work 14 months earlier for health reasons. His remaining files had been transferred at client request to another firm, Whitcomb and Lowe. Grandma Nell had left Fitch, quietly, over a year before she died, and moved her affairs to the very lawyer whose business card I'd found taped under her nightstand drawer. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my own shop for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. Because if Grandma Nell had gone to a new lawyer over a year ago, well before her diagnosis had progressed to anything serious, that meant the will Derek was so confidently quoting from, the old will equal split, 3 ways, might not be the will that mattered anymore at all. I called Whitcomb and Lowe that same afternoon and asked, as a grandchild and a family member listed as next of kin on the county's records, whether Daniel Whitcomb had handled any documents for my grandmother. The receptionist, professionally careful, told me she couldn't discuss the specifics of any client's file, but that Mr. Whitcomb would be in touch regarding the reading of the will once the estate was ready to be formally opened, and that as far as she understood it, I was listed as the estate's executor. Executor. Not Derek. Not my mother. Me. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my shop's back room, surrounded by buckets of unarranged carnations, and understood for the first time that whatever my grandmother had quietly done in that last year of her life, she had done it on purpose, and she had done it to protect something. I need you to understand something about the 2 weeks that followed, because it's the part of this story that still makes my hands shake a little when I tell it. I didn't confront anyone yet. I didn't call Derek screaming. I did what I do best, which is the same thing I do every single day at my shop, when a customer wants a memorial arrangement and gives me nothing to work with but a name and a date. I gathered information quietly, in order, and I let the picture assemble itself before I ever said a word out loud. The first person I called was my Aunt Patricia, Grandma Nell's younger sister, 74 years old, sharp as a tack, and the only person in my family who has never once softened an unpleasant truth for the sake of a nice Sunday dinner. Aunt Pat had visited Grandma Nell more than anyone realized, usually on weekday afternoons when the rest of the family assumed she was resting. "Your grandmother called me in February," Aunt Pat told me over the phone. Her voice lower than usual, the register she uses for things she's decided are finally worth saying out loud. She was upset. Derek had been over the week before with some man in a suit, talking about simplifying her finances, getting her to sign things she said she didn't fully understand. She told me she'd started feeling like she was being managed instead of visited. Aunt Pat paused. She said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "Patricia, I love that boy, but I am not going to let loving him make me stupid." I asked Aunt Pat if she knew anything about a new will. "I know she went to see a lawyer in March," Aunt Pat said. "I drove her myself. She wouldn't tell me exactly what she signed. She just said, 'If anything happens to me, you tell Maren to ask Daniel Whitcomb about the letter.'" I didn't understand what that meant at the time. I think I do now. A letter. There was a letter. The second thing I did was start paying closer attention to a story I'd heard secondhand from my mother a few days after the funeral. One that had bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time. My mother had mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek had confided in her that he was worried I'd been taking advantage of Grandma Nell financially over the past year, that I'd asked her for help covering a slow season at the shop, and that Grandma had told him she felt pressured to help me even though she was worried about her own finances. This was not true. I had never once asked my grandmother for money. If anything, the financial history ran in the opposite direction. 3 years earlier, when Derek's restaurant investment in his own city collapsed and left him $12,000 in debt to a supplier who was threatening legal action, I was the one who wired him the money, quietly, no fanfare, because he told me it was a medical emergency involving his son, and he was too embarrassed to ask our mother. He told me he'd pay me back within 6 months. That was 3 years ago. I never saw a dollar of it again, and I never brought it up. Because that's what you do in families like mine. You absorb the cost, and you don't make anyone uncomfortable by mentioning the math. Derek had taken that story, the one thing I'd actually done for him in good faith, and quietly inverted it into a rumor about me pressuring our dying grandmother for money. I sat with that for a long time. It wasn't just a lie. It was a smokescreen, laid down months in advance, so that if anyone ever noticed money moving strangely around Grandma Nell in her final year, the story already in circulation would point toward me instead of him. Have you ever had someone rewrite a story about you before you even knew there was a story being told? Drop the word receipts in the comments if that's ever happened to you, because I promise you, it happened to me, and it very nearly worked. The third piece came from Rosa Alvarez, Grandma Nell's next-door neighbor and closest friend for over 50 years. A woman in her 80s with a memory like a filing cabinet and absolutely no patience for nonsense. I brought her a bouquet from my shop's leftover stock, ostensibly just to check on her, and she poured me coffee at her kitchen table and told me things I hadn't thought to ask about yet. That grandson of hers was over here 4 times a week those last few months, Rosa said, stirring sugar into her cup with more force than the task required, always with that man in the suit trailing behind him like a shadow. I asked Nell about it once, over the fence, and she got a look on her face I hadn't seen since your grandfather was sick. Scared. Nell wasn't a woman who scared easy. Rosa told me something else. Something that made the back of my neck go cold. In late March, she'd seen Derek's car in the driveway on a Sunday morning, unusually early, and later that same week, Grandma Nell had mentioned to Rosa, almost offhand, that she'd signed some papers about the house that she didn't entirely remember agreeing to. That Derek had told her it was just for taxes. I told her to call her lawyer, Rosa said. The new one, Whitcomb. She said she already had. She said, "Don't worry, Rosa, I already fixed it." I already fixed it. I drove home that evening with those 4 words circling in my head like a hymn. My grandmother, in the fog of a diagnosis that was slowly taking her memory, Habia still had enough clarity, enough will of her own, to recognize she was being maneuvered, and to quietly build a countermeasure before anyone else even noticed the game being played. The fourth piece of the puzzle came from the county recorder's office, which in a town the size of Millbrook Falls is a public record anyone can search from their own kitchen table if they know what to look for. I searched the parcel number for the farmhouse on Larkspur Lane and found a document filed in late March. A quitclaim deed, transferring partial ownership of the property from Eleanor Bennett to Derek Bennett. Notarized, recorded, entirely legal on its face. Partial ownership. Not the whole house. Just enough, it turned out later, to give Derek legal standing to list the property and negotiate a sale, while the rest of the ownership interest remained with the estate, meaning with whoever the will ultimately named as heir. Derek's plan, I would later understand, wasn't actually to steal the whole house outright. It was to move fast enough before anyone read the actual will carefully that a sale would already be in motion, buyers already lined up, money already changing hands, so that by the time anyone challenged anything, unwinding it would feel impossible, expensive, and ugly enough that most families would just let it go rather than fight. He was betting on exhaustion. He was betting that grief makes people quiet, and quiet people don't check parcel numbers. He didn't know I check everything twice, the same way I double-check every invoice at my shop, because that's the discipline you build when you've spent 8 years running a small business on thin margins. He also didn't know about the brass key, or the letter Aunt Pat had mentioned, or that his own grandmother, months before her death, had quietly built the one thing that could stop him cold. 16 days after the funeral, I called Whitcomb and Lowe and formally requested a meeting as the estate's named. Executor Daniel Whitcomb turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a corner office that smelled like old paper, and pipe tobacco he clearly no longer smoked but hadn't gotten around to airing out. He had my grandmother's file open on his desk before I'd even finished sitting down, and he studied me for a long moment before he spoke, the way you'd study someone you'd been instructed, in advance, to look out for. "Your grandmother came to me 14 months ago," he said, She told me she wanted to move her affairs away from her previous attorney. No offense to Mr. Fitch intended, simply because she wanted, in her words, someone my grandson hasn't already had lunch with. He allowed himself a small, sad smile. She was sharper than most of my clients half her age, right up until the last few months. He slid a document across the desk. A will dated 14 months earlier, revised once more in March, just weeks before she died, properly witnessed, properly notarized, entirely superseding the older will Derek had been quoting from all along. It named me executor. It left the farmhouse and the majority of her estate to me, with a modest, specific bequest to Derek and a note that my mother would receive her mother's jewelry and household keepsakes, unchanged from the original plan. And then Whitcomb handed me a second envelope, sealed. My name written across the front in my grandmother's unmistakable looping handwriting, the same handwriting from every birthday card I'd ever received from her. She asked me to hold this, Whitcomb said, and give it to you personally once the will was read. She was very specific that it not go to anyone else first. I asked if I could open it there. He nodded and left the room to give me privacy, which I will always be grateful for, because I could not have read what was inside with another person watching my face. I'm not going to read you every word of that letter, because some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I can tell you what it said, in substance, because it's the reason everything that happened next happened the way it did. Grandma Nell wrote that she'd noticed, in the months after her diagnosis, that Derek's visits had a shape to them that felt less like love and more like a schedule, and that the man in the gray suit who kept appearing was, in her words, a fixer, not a friend. She wrote that she signed a document in March she didn't fully understand at the time, and that once she'd had a clear-headed morning afterward, she'd called Whitcomb immediately, horrified, and asked him to help her protect what mattered before her good days ran out. She wrote that she loved Derek and did not want this letter used to humiliate him, only to make sure the house, the garden, the life she'd built with her own hands, went to the person who had actually spent it with her. And then she wrote one line I have thought about nearly every day since. Maren, honey, you were never the one I worried about losing. You were the one I trusted to still be standing when everyone else had already left the room. I sat in that lawyer's office and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the night she died. Not because I was sad, though I was, but because for the first time in weeks I understood that I had not imagined any of it. I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been ungrateful or suspicious of my own brother without cause. My grandmother had seen exactly what was happening to her, and in the last clear months of her life, she had quietly built a wall around the truth strong enough that even her own decline couldn't knock it down. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because it wasn't dramatic and it wasn't fast. I called my closest friend from high school, Sarah Kessler, who's now an estate and elder law attorney 2 towns over, and I laid every document out on her dining room table the way you'd lay out ingredients before a recipe you can't afford to get wrong. Sarah went through everything twice, the way I check my own books twice, and told me the sentence that changed the entire shape of what I thought was possible. Maren, the March quitclaim deed was signed after your grandmother's diagnosis was already documented in her medical records, and it was signed without independent legal counsel present, at the direction of a man your grandmother's own attorney had never heard of and never vetted. That's a textbook undue influence claim. And more importantly, she tapped the newer will. This document, executed with full capacity, witnessed by 2 people including her own longtime physician, revokes everything Derek thinks he's standing on. He doesn't own a partial interest in a house he can freely sell. He owns a partial interest in an estate that's about to name you as the person controlling every decision about that property, including whether any sale he's arranged is valid at all. She looked at me over her glasses, the same careful voice she uses, I imagine, with every client she's ever had to deliver hard news to gently. Whatever you're planning to do with this, if you stick to the documents and you don't editorialize, there is nothing anyone can do to make this go away. Truth is a complete defense. Don't accuse. Don't guess at his motives out loud. Read the paper. I told her I wasn't planning to scream at anyone. I was planning to let the sale proceed exactly as far as Derek wanted it to, right up until the moment it couldn't proceed any further, and then hand him, personally, in front of the people he'd been performing for, the one document that ended it. Sarah grinned at me the way old friends do when they realize you finally stopped being quiet for the wrong reasons. "Then you'll want to know something else," she said, and turned her laptop toward me. "I pulled the listing this morning. Derek's realtor already has a buyer. Full price offer, contingencies waived, closing scheduled in 11 days. 11 days. Derek wasn't just planning to sell the house eventually. He was racing the clock, betting he could get the sale closed and the money distributed before the estate's actual will was ever formally read in a room with everyone in it. I found out later, from my mother, in one of the few completely honest conversations we've had in years, exactly why he was moving so fast. Derek's restaurant debt from 3 years earlier hadn't gone away. It had grown, quietly, with interest, into something closer to $30,000, a debt he had never disclosed to Alyssa or her family. He'd told Alyssa's parents that his share of Grandma Nell's estate would let him put a down payment on a house near their lake property before the wedding. The wedding Alyssa's parents were partially funding. The wedding that was supposed to be the proof that Derek had finally arrived somewhere respectable. The house sale wasn't just greed. It was a man trying to outrun a debt before the people whose approval he'd been chasing his whole life found out he'd never actually earned it. I let the 11 days run. I want you to understand why, because it's the part of this story people ask me about most. I could have stopped the sale the moment I confirmed the new will existed. Sarah could have filed an emergency notice with the title company within a day. But I had watched my brother build an entire narrative, a story about our grandmother, a story about me, a story about who deserved what, and I wasn't interested in a quiet legal letter that nobody but a title clerk would ever read. I wanted the same people who had watched him toast his own good fortune in our grandmother's kitchen to watch the floor come out from under him, at the exact moment he thought he'd already won. So I waited. And on the 12th day, one day after the closing Derek had scheduled, which Sarah had quietly ensured could not legally proceed, once the title company received formal notice of a competing, more recent will and an open undue influence claim, my brother called me, confused and furious, saying the closing had been delayed by some clerical issue, and asking if I knew anything about it. I told him I didn't know anything about a clerical issue. That part, at least, was true. He called a family dinner 2 nights later, at the farmhouse itself, ostensibly to regroup about the delay, though I suspect it was really an attempt to reassert control in front of an audience before anyone started asking harder questions. Alyssa and her parents were there. My mother was there. Aunt Pat came, though Derek clearly hadn't wanted her to. Rosa Alvarez showed up uninvited, carrying a casserole and an expression I recognized immediately, because it was the same expression she'd worn the day she told me, over coffee, exactly what she'd seen that winter. I brought the manila envelope, the letter, the copy of the new will, and Daniel Whitcomb's business card, because Sarah had advised me that having the actual attorney's contact information visible, rather than just my own claims, would end any argument before it could start. Derek stood at the head of the table, in that same kitchen, under the same crooked cabinet door Grandma Nell never let anyone fix, and raised a glass again, the way he had weeks earlier when I'd first walked in on his premature celebration. This time I didn't wait in the doorway. I walked straight to the table and set the envelope down in front of him. "Before you toast anything else," I said, keeping my voice as level as I keep it with any customer whose order has gone wrong through no fault of mine, I think everyone at this table should hear what Grandma actually decided, in her own words, while she still could. The room went quiet the way rooms do right before something true gets said out loud. I opened the envelope and read from the will, plainly, the way you'd read a delivery manifest, no flourish, just the facts in order. Executor, me. Primary heir to the property, me. The March quitclaim deed Derek had recorded, I explained calmly, had been signed after his own grandmother's diagnosis was already documented, without her own attorney present, and directed by a financial consultant Derek had personally brought into her home. It was already the subject of a legal challenge Sarah had filed that week. Alyssa's mother set her wine glass down very carefully, the exact same motion I'd later realize people make in this family's orbit whenever the ground shifts beneath somebody they'd been quietly evaluating all along. Derek's face went through the 4 stages I mentioned at the start of this story: confusion, disbelief, a flicker of anger, and then, underneath all of it, something closer to fear, The look of a man watching a debt he thought he'd successfully outrun catch up to him in front of the exact people he'd been trying to impress. "This is insane," he said, his voice climbing the way it does when he's losing an argument he expected to win easily. "She was confused at the end, Maren. Everyone knows that. That letter doesn't prove anything. You're twisting this because you've always resented that I got out of this town and you didn't." I let him finish. "I've learned, in 9 years of running a small business, that the quietest person with the most complete paperwork always ends up owning the room. And interrupting him would have only given the audience a reason to feel sorry for him instead of clear-eyed about what he'd done." "I'm not twisting anything," I said. "I'm reading you a document 2 witnesses and her own physician signed, dated 5 weeks before she died, and a letter she wrote to me by name, specifically because she was afraid this exact conversation would happen. If you want to argue she was too confused to know her own mind in March, you'll need to explain why the same court that hears that argument will also be looking at a quitclaim deed you filed that same month, using a man neither her longtime attorney nor her own family had ever met." That's when Rosa Alvarez, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table with her hands folded over her casserole dish, spoke up in the flat, unshakable voice of a woman who has outlived every reason to soften a hard truth. "I told your grandmother to call her lawyer the week she said she signed something she didn't understand," Rosa said. "She told me she already had. She told me I already fixed it, Rosa." I didn't know what she meant then. I do now. Aunt Pat added her own piece without being asked. The phone call from February, the man in the gray suit, the fear in Grandma Nell's voice. And my mother, who had said almost nothing since I walked in, finally spoke, in a small voice I barely recognized. "I knew she'd changed lawyers," she said, looking at her hands instead of at either of us. "She told me not to tell either of you. She said she needed time to think. I should have said something. I just didn't want to believe it meant what it meant." That was the sentence that undid the whole evening, more than anything I'd read aloud. Not an outburst, a quiet confession, from the one person in the room who had known enough, months earlier, to have stopped this before it ever became a story worth telling. Alyssa's father stood first, the way men like that do when a meeting has clearly ended, buttoning his jacket, murmuring something about needing to head back. Alyssa didn't move right away. She looked at Derek for a long moment, the way you look at a house after an inspection has come back with problems you can't unsee. And then she quietly picked up her purse and followed her parents out the door without another word to him. I found out 3 weeks later through my mother that the engagement was over within the month. Derek didn't yell. He didn't storm out either. He sat back down at the head of the table. In the kitchen, his grandmother had fed our whole family from for 60 years, and put his face in his hands. And for one brief human moment before the anger came back, I saw something in him that looked almost like the boy I grew up with. The one who used to be scared of the dark and would crawl into my room at night before either of us learned that our family rewarded confidence over honesty every single time. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that, because it would have been easy to, and it would have felt good for about 5 minutes and cost me something afterward that I wasn't willing to spend. I simply said, "The sale's not happening, Derek. Whitcomb's already filed the notice with the title company. If you want to contest the will, you're welcome to, but Sarah tells me the medical records alone make that a very expensive way to lose. I'd rather you didn't. I'd rather we just told the truth about what actually happened and let it be over." He didn't answer me that night. He left without saying goodbye to anyone, and I stood in that kitchen, under that crooked cabinet door, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly, but a kind of settling, the way a house settles on its foundation after a long, heavy storm has finally passed through. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived on their own schedule, the way they tend to once you stop chasing them and simply let the truth sit where you've put it. The sale was formally voided. The buyers, understandably spooked by a title dispute, walked away without a fight. Craig Doyle, the realtor, quietly stopped returning Derek's calls once word got around town, because Millbrook Falls is small enough that everyone eventually hears the same version of every story. The undue influence claim against the March deed was settled without a courtroom, Derek's own attorney advising him, apparently, that fighting a diagnosed dementia patient's documented medical timeline in front of a judge was not a fight worth having. Derek kept the modest bequest Grandma Nell had specifically left him in her final will, enough to make a dent in his debt. not enough to buy anyone's approval. The engagement ended. I heard secondhand that Alyssa told a mutual friend she couldn't stop thinking about the way Derek had looked that night, more upset about being caught than about what he'd actually done to his own grandmother's memory. I don't know if that's exactly what she said. I know it's the kind of sentence that gets repeated in a small town, whether it's word for word accurate or not, and I know it matched something true. My mother and I had a longer conversation. Weeks later, sitting on Grandma Nell's porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. She apologized, not performatively, not the way Derek would have, but plainly, the way you apologize when you've finally run out of reasons to protect someone else's comfort over someone else's truth. I think I always let him get away with things because it was easier than admitting I'd raised a son who needed people to get away with things for him, she said. I'm sorry I let that easier version cost you something. I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't entirely fine. But I told her I was glad she'd finally said it, and that felt like enough of a beginning for both of us. Here's the part of this story I actually want you to remember, more than the reading of the will, more than the moment Derek's face went gray in his own kitchen. 2 weeks after that dinner, I drove out to the farmhouse alone on a Saturday morning. The first genuinely free morning I'd had since the funeral, and I walked back to Grandma Nell's garden, which had gone shaggy and half wild in the weeks nobody had tended it. I spent the whole day out there, on my knees in the dirt, exactly the way she taught me 40 years ago, cutting back the dead growth, staking the dahlias that had flopped over in a late spring storm, replanting the border of marigold she always put in to keep the rabbits away from the tomatoes. I didn't do it because I'd won anything. I did it because that garden was the actual inheritance, the thing no lawyer's letter or quitclaim deed had ever been able to touch, and I wanted my hands in that dirt again the way she'd had hers in it for 60 years. I invited Rosa and Aunt Pat over the following Sunday, the first Sunday dinner at that farmhouse since the funeral, and we ate at the same kitchen table under the same crooked cabinet door, and it felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the house was actually being lived in by people who loved it for what it was, rather than what it could be sold for. I haven't cut Derek out entirely. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters. I don't call him every week. I'm not interested in pretending the last several months didn't happen. But when he texted me on what would have been Grandma Nell's 90th birthday, just a short message that said he'd been thinking about her garden and hoped it was doing all right, I texted back a photo of the dahlias in full bloom. I didn't add anything clever or pointed. I just let the photo be the whole answer. Some doors you lock. Some you just stop slamming and leave slightly open, in case the person on the other side of it ever actually decides to walk through honestly, instead of strategically. I still run Bennett & Bloom. Business has actually picked up since the spring. Mostly word of mouth. The kind of quiet reputation that spreads through a small town when people hear you handled something difficult with more grace than anyone expected of you. I still do every funeral arrangement myself, still slower and more careful than any other order I take. And every peony that comes through my shop this time of year, I think of her, and of the letter she left me, and of that one line I will carry for the rest of my life. You were never the one I worried about losing. You were the one I trusted to still be standing when everyone else had already left the room. That's the whole story. Not a house won in a courtroom, though I did keep the house. Not a brother destroyed, though I imagine some of you wanted that ending, and I understand why. What I actually got back was quieter than that, and better. I got back a garden nobody can quitclaim out from under me. A table people sit at because they love the house, not because they're angling for it. And the certainty, finally, that the quiet ones in every family are so often the ones actually holding the real paperwork. If someone in your life has ever tried to cash in on a loved one before you even had time to grieve them properly, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not the only one who's ever had to add it all up in the dark. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who's been the quiet one in their own family for far too long, and subscribe to Her Quiet Reckoning, because the next story is coming, and I think you're going to want to be here for it.